Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to speak a little bit more about, as the title says, Homebrew's biggest migration we've ever had to do. So we have various kind of hosting providers that we've used over the years, and this was our kind of biggest, gnarliest migration that we've ever had to make. So Heel's great talk earlier about migrations. That was a lot more, I feel like, directly applicable tips to how to manage your next migration, whereas this is a bit more kind of anecdote story-y, and there's a few kind of random things hopefully you can learn along the way. So the other interesting thing about, I guess, this migration, as you'll see, is it was done at fairly short notice with a very hard deadline and done mostly most of the people involved were open source maintainers and therefore mostly volunteers. So let's start with some background. Sorry, not that. Sorry, if you, just a warning about this talk, like the jokes I'm gonna make in this talk are really, really bad. Like, I tried to like pre-run some of them on people and they said like, you know, that's kind of so bad, it sort of starts to be funny again. So we'll see what we do here. I'm not really sorry, but anyway, some background on me and Homebrew. So my name is Mike McQuaid. Thanks for the lovely introduction, Tanya, wherever you are over there. I recently joined a company called Raise.dev. I've sort of co-founded that with some ex-GitHub people. I spent a decade at GitHub where I left my job as a principal engineer earlier this year. And I'm nowadays Homebrew's project leader, which is this kind of weird democratically elected sort of tech lead sort of figurehead position that I am doing. And yeah, it's all very weird, but I like it. I've been doing it for 14 years. Alice's talk earlier, she kind of mentioned, I can't remember what percentage it was of her life she'd spent at the Financial Times. I realized it's something like 36% of my life I've spent working on Homebrew now, which is super weird. Any Homebrew users in the house? Yay, that's nice. Anyone contributed to Homebrew ever? Like got pull requests merged? And okay, a couple of people, that's nice. Anyone, this is the one that happens sometimes that I'm always really scared of. Has anyone made a Homebrew pull request and I personally have rejected your pull request? No, that's good. There's a non-trivial number of times that comes up and it makes me sad. So I'm also going to try in this talk, I guess one of the fun things about talking about open source stuff is that like a lot of the conversations that you might see in this talk have occurred on the public internet, so you can go and look. The cases where things have been private, I kind of have censored people a little bit more. An old coworker from GitHub, Ben Bolter, wrote this thing. Particularly if you work in a kind of async or kind of remote-friendly culture, like this is really worth a read. I think everything having a URL is a great method of knowledge sharing. It's also a great method if you're a bit antisocial of just getting people to go away. Ben's principle was once he got asked the same question like 3 times at GitHub, he would just, as long as there was nothing sensitive in it, he would just write a blog post about it and then just link people to the blog post rather than explaining things. So there's going to be lots of URLs. If you want to take out your phone and snap them so you catch them because there's a lot of slides, feel free. So let's start. A little bit of an intro with Homebrew itself. So Homebrew started in London in 2009, built by a guy called Max Howell. So sort of built from source package manager for what was at the time called Mac OS 10. There's this little like unverified thing that I don't really know what GitHub's doing there, but I verified that this is true, so I can do this verification stuff. It was also like, I don't know, has anyone heard the term README-driven development? That's like okay, a few people. So like this is this idea that I read about a few years ago, which I think Homebrew was an early example, maybe before it was described, of like before you start a project, maybe internal or external, like write the documentation first of what you think you might want it to look like and how it should work, and then start actually building the thing. When I was at GitHub, we did that for like blog posts. Like you might write the ship blog post of like internal or externally, like how do you want to announce this to people before you even decided what you're going to build, and then kind of work backwards from that. So this was a nice example. You can go and look at the first commit of Homebrew and see like Max describing what it's going to do. If you've ever been confused about the sort of beer theme, like this kind of answers your question of why it has that. Would Homebrew be better or worse if it was not devised under the influence? Please write 1,000 words and have it on my desk by the end of the conference. Thank you. So Max is also known for this tweet. I don't know if anyone saw this somewhat infamous thing. Like this number, as many of my friends at Google have corrected me, like this is not actually true, but it is funny. So I just thought I should put that up there. And I'm sure some of us can empathize with this early critique of technology hiring practices. Homebrew is split into 2 main parts. There's like the package manager itself, which we call Homebrew Brew, because that's the name of the repository on GitHub. It's got like fewer contributors, but it's kind of sort of the meat and bones behind like the kind of wider scale of the Homebrew ecosystem. If you look at the language breakdown, you can sort of see like it's mostly written in Ruby. Some people have said Homebrew's code is rough, but actually only 2.4% of it is rough. Homebrew core contains the package descriptions, which we call formulae. It ends with an AE because Homebrew's prose guidelines state that we follow British English in Homebrew. We have 3 cheers for British English, everyone. It used to be a relatively common thing in early Homebrew. I would say maybe 1 in every 100 to 200 pull requests were people trying to go and like correct things that have been spelt wrongly. And then, like, if they had one of the American maintainers would receive that PR, it would be handled diplomatically. And if it was like a British or Scottish maintainer, then generally that pull request went very poorly, very fast. My first Homebrew, personally, like my first commit, sorry, was in 2009. And Homebrew, like, you can still see if you've done any Homebrew stuff, like there's sort of, it still looks fairly similar to what it was today. Every formula back then, that's what we call the package description files, had this require brew kit at the top. That was to illustrate the open source principle of you brew kit, you fix it. So I'm really sorry. I know that these are bad, and they are only going to get worse. So the part of Homebrew that I personally am sort of proudest of as my own like feature that I kind of built was all like binary packager. Like binary packages. So I helped Homebrew kind of move from like being everything built from source to being like, we build some stuff and then redistribute it, and then that makes things a little bit quicker. So there's these things, bottles, which we're kind of leading on to why these matter in a minute. So that's a name I came up with. And yeah, if you don't like that name, I apologize from the bottom of my heart. I'm sorry. So Homebrew's formula have these kind of bottle descriptions in them, and they were hosted by a company called Bintray, who kind of provides lots of kind of free package hosting and stuff like that. And the nice thing about Bintray is they were super reliable, and like there's basically no chance of them ever going away. Oh no, this doesn't look very good. So yeah, it's not great when you wake up and see that. And wait, can you see, if you look really closely under the birds, there's like oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, so this was really bad. Like again, no shade thrown on Bintray, the company, or, you know, they provided a lot of free stuff to us for a very long time. So thank them very much for that. But I guess compared to like some of the internal deadlines I've kind of used to dealing with, where people say, oh, this has to be done in 2 months. And you can say, oh, pretty please. Oh, okay, 3 months, fine. Like when you read a post like this and it's like, okay, sub 2 months from now, everything's getting shut down that Homebrew is using to distribute our binary packages. And some short period after that, if you haven't migrated everything, we're just going to delete it. So my first response was like, that's not nice. Like, I'm going to tell my mom and dad on you. You're being really mean. But thankfully, some people in GitHub reached out fairly early on, and we were able to kind of have a conversation about this. Obviously, this is a private DM. I'm sure Edward wouldn't mind me sharing this, but yeah, like my initial response was, this could be really, really bad. Ed nicely immediately suggested we could kind of take some time to talk about it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any time, so I used Basil instead. That was yeah, come on, that didn't even get a chuckle. That's good. I don't deserve any laughs for this, so please don't give me them. It just encouraged me. So the community noticed shortly afterwards, and then started asking what's going on. That's the nice thing about, if I can say something about the Homebrew community, there's been some kind of, you know, strange ups and downs over the years, but like, it's a really nice feeling knowing that there's so many people who will jump on and want to help out with these types of things straight away, right? And we immediately had a deluge of offers from people being like, my employer could maybe help with the hosting, or I can help with the migration, or whatever it may be. So that was pretty cool. So we started to figure out what's the best solution that we can go for. It was at this time, like during the pandemic, that people had been encouraging me like, hey, maybe you should go and like build a relationship with senior executives because that's a good idea. And if you're like me, like petrified of talking to senior executives, that I can verify that at least some of them are actually humans and they do want to help you. So like I reached out to Nat, and at that time the CEO of GitHub, and he kind of said like, yeah, like we should do this. And like it, from my perspective, with a project like this, with like a relatively short time scale where like I'm looking to kind of claw some internal resources, like it did really help knowing that I could say, wow, like the CEO says it's okay, so we'll figure it out. So yeah, so I encourage you, speak to your senior executives. As I might say to my kids, they're much more scared of you than you are of them. So we're going to go URL-less for a little bit, because this is mainly when we go into the kind of private homebrew conversation part of the talk. So that's our kind of rough like bandwidth and storage requirements we had. Those of you who are used to kind of dealing with tiny scales or really big scales will have different feelings about those. Like, I feel like we're sort of comfortably in the middle of like, if we just, whap out a credit card and pay for the wrong thing, then it's going to get very expensive very quickly. But at the same time, it's probably not going to be too hard for us to find someone who can host this and is willing to do so for free. So we kind of had quite a bit of discussion, like high level, as I mentioned before. We had various companies and individuals offering kind of services. And it narrowed down fairly quickly to kind of two options for us. So one was the Internet Archive, who will actually host really pretty much any data for pretty much anyone, as long as you're willing to kind of meet their requirements. And we wanted to kind of be nice citizen of the public internet, I guess. So we had some conversations with them, and they were like, yeah, you can use this. You could, in theory, just do everything the same way you're doing it now and upload it to us. But we would rather you kind of made some modifications, and those modifications were going to be a bit tricky for us. And then there was GitHub Packages, which is floated as an option. So people internally said, like, this is something we could use, and it wasn't quite clear necessarily how, but they were like, we've got the bandwidth, and we can dedicate some technical resources to making this work out for you. So, like, this thing that I learned about through this process is there's this thing like the OCI image format specification. In Scotland, we call it actually the OCI image format. And GitHub Packages supported this. And it's a little bit gnarly getting your head around. Like, if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, then there's a nice Medium post actually about this. But basically, what this lets you do is if you have certain types of effectively like Docker image registries, and you can kind of like sculpt the data that you want to store in the right format, you can store kind of just arbitrary data as long as you have it effectively looks like a tarball with some kind of JSON metadata surrounding it. So in our case, we did already, our binary packages were just a tarball, and we did have some kind of JSON metadata that we were using ourselves anyway, so this felt like this could be kind of a nice combination. And there was a nice little proof of concept, someone in GitHub like built for us pretty quickly, that kind of demonstrated like uploading and downloading this stuff is not too hard. So we can kind of continue these internal conversations, and like it's always tricky in these environments because I find myself kind of having to wear two different hats, like where I'm like, on one hand, I am a GitHub employee and I know things inside the company that I can kind of maybe share privately in a small group like outside the company, but I'm not going to say on the public internet just yet, at least. And then like I've got my homebrew maintainer hat, where it's like, I'm running this open source project and I want to do what's best for it. Despite the fact that Homebrew supported Linux at this time, I need to clarify neither of these hats are red. So no shade thrown at the Internet Archive, but after some investigation, it was looking like we were going to have to kind of wrangle our data in a particular way that for it to not disrupt them, which was going to be very disruptive to us. And it also looked like the potential for people to be able to kind of upload stuff and make it look like we had uploaded it was going to be a bit tricky. Again, no shade on them at all. Like that's just, I think we were trying to fit a square peg into their round hole. Unfortunately, my attempts at wearing the two hats didn't work terribly well. There was some kind of insinuation from some of the kind of homebrew maintainers that effectively I was being paid to tell people that we should be using the GitHub solution and that I was not being objective and blah, blah, blah because of that perspective. And yeah, it's kind of tricky to convince people of those types of things because almost by definition, I am not the person who can convince them because whatever I say, I'm just being paid to say that. But yeah, I guess the other thing that I thought was interesting about this, how many times have any of you been involved with discussions that maybe get a little bit heated and someone says, can we please just focus on the technical issues instead of emotions and feelings? I'm sure a lot of us can relate. Please don't be that. Like, obviously there's times where it's maybe someone is like, this particular JSON schema change is really upsetting to me. Like, okay, like there's times when people, maybe myself included, can get a little bit too involved, but particularly when you are talking about like relatively high pressure, like big migrations like this, like if you're like consistently getting the feedback, or someone in your team is consistently getting the feedback that they are delivering information in a way that is hurting the feelings of other people, like that's important. Like, right? Humans have feelings too, and we need to consider them as much, if not maybe more, than technical issues until ChatGPT can write all our code for us. And probably by that time, we're going to have to consider ChatGPT's feelings too. So we've seen a little bit about like the ideas. We were a few approaches going around with some people favoring one approach, others favoring another. So ultimately, like a lot of engineering work, it came down to who's going to do the work, and they're probably going to get to influence that decision. So timescale-wise, somewhat amusingly, a few weeks before this bin tray migration was announced, well, sorry, the bin tray shutdown was announced, someone actually merged this, where they added support to like upload our stuff like optionally, not as kind of part of our main workflows, but essentially using our tooling to the Internet Archive, and they were kind of playing around with that themselves. And yeah, like it got us a decent amount of the way to where we needed to be, but because this was before the announcement and before we'd had conversations with the Internet Archive, it didn't quite meet all the requirements we would have needed. And at this point, I was fairly heavily convinced that GitHub Packages was going to be the best fit for us, because Homebrew was already relying on GitHub very heavily for code hosting. At that point, we'd moved all our stuff over to Actions. There was a certain amount of integration between those, and also like arguments about maybe like downtime and things like that. We're like, well, if GitHub.com is down, then Homebrew's effectively you're not going to be able to get updates anyway. So it's maybe more of a limited blast radius there. Like if you have strong opinions about the way I've framed this, I would love to hear them, because one of the tricky things with Homebrew is I'm by far the person with the most kind of experience in the industry. So I'm mainly working with a lot of like, often like even like undergraduate students and stuff like that. So I don't always have the kind of mentorship and peers that I can bounce these things off that I would love to have. So again, I don't expect you to read any of this. It's tiny, but again, I'm sure we can all relate. Like one of the things that's sometimes really frustrating, but really important with these types of big migrations is like, there's probably going to be an awful lot of back and forth, right? There's going to be a lot of discussion about the merits and the pros and the cons, and have you thought about this and have you thought about that? And I can relate as well, like how much you just want to be like, look, we basically decided, can we just stop now? But I do think, particularly in the cases where open source and StaffPlus engineering are very aligned, like one of them I think is that in both cases you tend to have mainly soft power and not a lot of hard power. In open source case, I basically have no hard power. I can't make anyone do anything ever. I can just, at most I can say, we're not going to merge this PR in this state, but I can't say, hey, you broke this thing, go fix this thing. Like, if they don't want to do it, they don't have to do it. So if I want to kind of bring people alongside with me, and I don't want to be personally on a 24/7, 365 rotation for fixing any issues with this, I need to make sure that like enough, maybe not everyone, but at least the folk who are going to be stepping in to help maintain the code, stepping in when I'm asleep to kind of fix any issues Homebrew's having here, are not aggravated and are like broadly in agreement with what needs to be done. So on March 11th, we landed like the first pull request for some kind of basic support for kind of using GitHub packages in this way. At this time, I was lucky enough at GitHub, like working on Homebrew was never actually my job there, but I was basically able to say like, hey, like I'm sort of working on sort of GitHub stuff, right? It's got GitHub in the name. So can I do this Homebrew GitHub stuff like full time for a bit, please? Thanks. And yeah, and my manager was cool with it. So yeah, because I was able to spend like all of my time on it, it took like about a month to kind of get us to this point, which was really nice. And yeah, and ironically, the person who made the Internet Archive pull request earlier on was almost like the biggest, loudest fan of the GitHub packages approach. And they were playing around with it lots and kind of learning lots and kind of sharing that and providing some good review and testing and stuff like that. Given the fact that he's Canadian, we'll never actually know whether he was doing that because he thought it was the right thing to do or just because Canadians are really nice and they like to make people happy, right? So initially we used this tool called ORAS. If you're looking for almost like you want to play around with this stuff of like uploading random stuff to Docker registries like this, then this is like a pretty easy tool to just get started with because it was way simpler than rolling our own client to begin with. But then we moved to using this thing called Scopio, which is a bit more kind of widely used, widely maintained. It's a little bit more involved to kind of get it set up and pass all the metadata in the right way. But for us, by that point, like we were using our own custom metadata and stuff like that. And then the nice thing is you can still just use plain old curl in our case to download stuff. Like at the authentication end and like getting the data once you know what you're getting is actually pretty straightforward. So like the nice thing as well, like Homebrew's work on this kind of encouraged the people inside of GitHub to be like, hey, we should probably like actually publish that this is a thing we support. So they were going around various places on the internet, like publishing like guides for how to use GitHub packages in this way. And eventually by April the 8th, we were able to kind of switch our defaults for our beta branch for Homebrew so that everyone started downloading all their stuff from GitHub packages instead of bin tray. We had a little while where we just uploaded everything into both places. And then we were able later that day to tell people who asked the original discussion, like, yeah, we've done this. Here's when it's going to land. Here's when you can expect to use it. So that also resulted in the internal discussions being basically concluded by the fact that the work had been done. A solution had been, although not universally agreed that we should do it that particular way, certainly no one cared enough about going another direction that they wanted to be like, no, I'm going to build this completely separate way of doing this thing. So we kind of did it. So what did we actually end up with in the end? So you can go to like this URL if you really care and see like Homebrew's packages and like poke around and see like in what format and structure that we upload this stuff. And everyone's best friend OpenSSL is like the most popular package, so it's right at the top. So if you click through to that page, you can see like the download counts and stuff like that, and this nice little kind of custom UI we have for how to install it from Homebrew, which GitHub added for us, and stuff like that. And then you can see like Docker images can be for like multiple architectures, so is our stuff, so we kind of play all nicely with all that as well. And in Homebrew, like this is where I guess the metadata I mentioned earlier. So every install package in Homebrew, again, more beer-themed stuff, has a thing called a tab, which is a JSON file, which has various bits of metadata for like that's relevant to your installation. And this has existed before, and we thought, hey, this seems nice. We're dealing with like JSON metadata and stuff anyway. So we couldn't embed it quite how we wanted because of the JSON schema for these kind of manifest files. So unfortunately, we have a JSON string field, which itself contains JSON, which I'm sorry. But it did allow us to do a few other things. And that's the cool things, I guess some of you may have found with some of these migration projects, is they sometimes result in unintended benefits that come alongside. So because we were pulling this JSON out of the bottle file, this was one of the last things that effectively made it 100, like with the JSON in the bottle file, that was going to be different every time you generated the package. Whereas if you pull it outside and download and store it separately, then in theory, at least, you can generate the package so it is the same every time. And then that gives this kind of reproducible builds effort, mainly a Linux distro effort. Like it provides some sort of support in Homebrew for like that type of workflow. And it also let us, because the way these Docker registries store data, it's all like content addressed data. So if we could make stuff more reproducible, and we had stuff that was being generated on Mac and Linux that ended up with the same artifact at the end, then we could kind of lean into that, have just one package that we can avoid generating like 6 packages, and then we can reduce the resource load on our host and stuff like that. So eventually the momentous day came when the best part of any software migration project, after bin tray shut down, we were able to bin all of the related code. And the members of the community built on top of that work that we'd built. So now basically anyone can use like the same way of uploading to GitHub packages that we do. Like someone built a nice tool so that when you create a tap, like our version of like third-party repos, you can build that in GitHub Actions and have it all upload to GitHub packages for you. So the other nice thing to kind of come out of it was there was some concerns along the way of like, well, what if GitHub packages starts being weird or GitHub goes down or whatever, and we need to kind of talk with them. So we had like a shared Slack channel now, which particularly now I've left GitHub is rather useful, where people in GitHub can join this channel and people in Homebrew can join this channel, and then we can kind of talk to each other on our respective Slacks. And we've set that up for Mac Stadium as well, who provide our like Mac CI, and Open Collective, who are our fiscal host. Nice little graph, see if you can spot when Homebrew started using GitHub packages. So that's GitHub packages like overall load. We caused a 3.5x increase in their download requests. And apparently on their side, there was no increased memory or CPU usage, which was pretty nice. And then GitHub was even able to get some nice like marketing blurb from the lovely Canadian who can't say no to things on there as well. And I guess the final aftermath, again, like any migration project, or at least the ones I'm involved with, I broke some stuff for people which I didn't even know was a thing. So we were able to like work with the community and figure this stuff out pretty quickly. And I think, again, nice accepting community. People accepted that like this migration, our hand was forced on the timescale somewhat. So we were able to kind of move forward. Although you get these tricky edges of things like Homebrew where there were bugs where it's like to repro, step one is connect from your computer in China, which sadly I do not have. But we managed to get through it and people are understanding. But sometimes it's not working and that's not our fault, honest. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to everything today. If you're interested in Homebrew stuff, if you want to talk, if you're interested in being a maintainer or anything like that, please reach out to me either on this email address or Mastodon, Twitter, or the QA session afterwards. I'm also working like personally now on some stuff to make Homebrew better for companies, particularly around like collaboration, security, compliance, support, stuff like that. So if there's stuff that you or people in your organization find really irritating or annoying about Homebrew, and you worry like, oh, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but like, no, do come up to me and tell me for one day only, like everything you hate about using Homebrew in your company, and that will actually be useful to me. So thank you very much.